Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our workshop. My name is Zach Berlant. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a undergraduate senior here at Washington University. And I'll be moderating this session as well as one tomorrow morning. This is workshop number 10, Emerging Trends in Renewable Energy, an ambitious new path towards 24/7 carbon-free electricity in the Midwest. This is a 1.5-hour workshop, so we will conclude at 10:30 a.m. If you're looking for a different workshop, now is your chance to relocate. Before we begin, I wanted to walk through a few items, both for the people in this room as well as our attendees joining virtually via Zoom on the Whova app. If you're joining us online, please keep your microphone off. For questions, I'll be monitoring the chat and we'll read them out during question sessions after each of our speakers present. If you look at the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see several tabs, and these include Q&A, which is a chance to submit questions to the presenters, polls, where you may be asked to respond to questions from the speakers, chat, which is an open chat room where you can interact with presenters and fellow attendees, and the community tab, which allows you to interact with the full audience of attendees at the summit. These are all part of Whova, not within Zoom. Also, a recording of the workshop will be made available in the next few days on the Whova app. All of the content from the summit will be available on the app for the next 3 months. Make sure when you're entering a question or remark, you're in the proper area. And I'll be monitoring the Q&A and chat sections of the app and help field questions for our speakers today. With that, let me introduce today's presenters. So on Zoom, Benjamin Gerber will be joining us. He's the President and Chief Executive Officer of Emirates. Under his leadership, Emirates developed and successfully implemented an industry-leading environmental attribute registry across all North American markets. The Emirates platform brings unprecedented innovation to the industry as well as access to data in pioneering ways, such as an hourly production and the first-hour REC retirement in electricity markets and carbon pathway tracking for thermal markets. And joining us here in person today is Jordan Oster. Jordan is the Energy Outreach Manager with the Iowa Environmental Council, the state's largest environmental coalition. In his 5th year with the organization, Jordan leads education and advocacy initiatives that advance a 100% clean energy future at the state and local level. It's all yours.
Thank you, and I think Jordan, I'm starting. Hopefully, can everybody hear me all right? I'll take that as a yes. I really apologize for not being there. It actually probably was a good thing that Minneapolis is getting hit with what they're saying is supposed to be the largest snowstorm in 40 years or 30 years, because it sounds like I came down with COVID this morning. So it's a good thing that I was stuck in Minneapolis, so I didn't put anyone else at risk. We're supposed to get 2 feet of snow, and it started yesterday, and there's a lull right now. So again, I apologize. I was really excited. This is a group of folks that I don't always get to talk to in the university municipality space. So hopefully I will make it out next year, and we won't have weather or health issues. So I wanted to, by the way, I like things being conversational, which is why it's hard that I'm on Zoom. So if anybody in the audience does want to ask a question while I'm presenting, to jump up and ask something, I'm okay with that. I don't just as long as it may be hard for me to see, but anyways, if you want to do that, that would be great. A little bit about Emirates. So we have our roots in the Midwest. However, as you heard from the introduction, we do track nationally, and that was an important piece of our growth. In 2018, we built and launched our own technology platform. We've grown quite a bit. We went from having 4 employees and 3 contract software developers. We just hired our 17th employee last week, almost all in the Midwest, and most in Minnesota. And we have 16 full-time contract developers, including our own team of internal software developers. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's been an increased focus on environmental attribute certificates, which I'll explain in a few moments. A unique thing about us that separates us from some of our other sister tracking systems is that we are an independent nonprofit. We have state regulators on our board, including people from the Wisconsin Public Service Commission staff. We have one of our board members from the Manitoba Municipal Government. So we are international. We track across Canada as well. And we have representatives from the co-ops, municipals, and investor-owned utilities, as well as some subject area experts, including environmental attribute traders and others with expertise in growing these markets. So how do we do all of this? Well, it's really through technology. Our system is focused on providing greater access to data. That's something you'll hear me talk a lot about. One of the greatest impediments to decarbonization and measuring impact is the lack of access to data. I think one of the more frustrating pieces about all of this is that the data exists. I was in Washington, D.C. 2 weeks ago, or a week ago, which is where I may have caught COVID at the NARUC conference, and I had meetings with members of our congressional delegation and others to talk about this issue, including with folks in the EQB and the White House, about the fact that that data exists at levels such as the RTO, or regional transmission organizations like MISO, SPP, or PJM, but they're often not accessible to important market participants, and oftentimes not accessible to researchers as well. And what that requires is flexible, scalable digital solutions to providing greater access to this data. And it also, I would argue, and I've been preaching about this, that the energy industry as a whole is woefully behind in technology adoption. Often the larger customers like yourselves, especially universities, have a better understanding of what's happening on their system than the utilities have as a total view of their system. That's not always the case, but I used to work with large C&I customers in my previous role with the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, and we see that quite often, that large consumers often have a better idea of what's happening. And then it's important for us to be talking to groups like this to encourage innovation and collaboration and learning. I often find that I learn more from these types of interactions, which is why I'm frustrated that I can't be there in person, because talking and hearing what customers are doing is what allows us to build new solutions for them. I thought it was important to start off with what is a REC, because I sometimes jump into that and not everyone is as familiar as I expect. But and this, what's interesting about this is this has been the definition of a renewable energy certificate for probably the last 20 years or 20 plus years, although this is starting to change. And right now, 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy equals 1 whole certificate. And because electricity flows under the laws of physics, you can't guarantee that an electron that was produced by a wind farm, a solar farm, a hydro facility is actually directly delivered to a customer. Depending on the grid and where you are, you can have a good understanding of the likelihood, but it's impossible to say with certainty. And that fluctuates depending on where you are. And so what we've created, or the market has created, is the idea of renewable or energy attribute certificates. So you decouple the physical underlying commodity, electricity, from the environmental attributes of that commodity, and they are traded separately. So electricity is put onto the grid, it's considered null power. It's sold into power markets, so ISOs, RTOs, or a grid operator or utility in some parts of the country. And then there's two markets that environmental attribute certificates are important. There's the RPS markets. So if your state or province has a requirement to procure a certain amount of electricity, that would fall under the RPS. And then there's voluntary markets. So there's evolving trends around corporate and when I mean corporate, I include municipality, large customers, as well as small and medium-sized customers, but those that have their own non-mandated renewable energy procurement goals. And then this is what a REC looks like. So it's really a digital certificate. It's kind of interesting because we've been caught up in this discussion for the last few years about NFTs and blockchain, which our system is not, nor do I think it's necessary for our solution. I think it's actually, in many cases, a solution in search of a problem, but not always. But a lot of people talk about tokens. An airline mile is a token. A REC is, you could think of it like a token. It's a digital representation of an attribute. And in this case, you have a REC. It has the generator ID, the state in which it was produced, the month, the year. We are adding and have started adding the hours, and we are going to be tracking down to the watt level by hour pretty soon. The year, each batch of certificates, because there is still issued in monthly batches, have a batch number, and then the number of certificates finally at the end. So what is what are we looking to do here? And I'm going to explain in a second what 24/7 is and where we see these evolving trends going. But there's really we see a need to build tools to accommodate this evolving market. And the market energy markets are evolving faster now than they probably ever have, or in the last 20 years. And we believe that it's really important for digital tools to evolve to help measure the impact that certain decisions are providing towards our decarbonization goals. And specifically to MRETs, it's a more granular energy attribute market, so that you're actually producing certificates and consuming them and able to match on an hourly basis. And why is this important? Well, I've used this slide for a few years and I still love it because I think it shows, it's from the International Energy Agency, but it really shows how our market has is evolving so quickly to that producers and consumers, large customers, the electrification of transportation, the interest in business and industry and understanding their consumption, whether it's through building solar panels as part of their operations. And so I think it's really important to see that as this changes, we need to update our tools to measure what that is. And so what is this idea of 24/7 CFE? And I'm gonna, these may be new terms to you and they are to a lot of people. I promise I won't read these for you, but I will give you a quick overview. There's two evolving trends that have really been the impetus or the main movers behind what we're seeing in corporate or large customer procurement. And there's the 24/7 CFE and the emissionality route. 24/7 CFE was really pioneered by Google. I'm sure if you find someone else has talked about it before them, however, they are often credited with this idea of matching production and consumption on an hourly basis. And they are doing it in a way that, sorry, I meant to mute that before I had a cough, but their belief is that one way to decarbonize the grid is to match those production and consumption. And they really started this trend on the corporate side from moving away from just 24/7 renewables to carbon-free and pushing for nuclear and other options that move beyond the traditional definition of renewables. And then there's this evolving trend of emissionality. I think that the credit for this idea really is should be credited to Boston University, and it's really focused on maximizing emissions, where 24/7 CFE is often thought about in deliverability. There's an idea that there should be deliverability, or you should be in the same region of an RTO or control area, or even smaller. Emissionality is very different, and what Boston University did is there was actually quite a bit of disagreement over this within the university system, but a professor who what I've understood from talking to Boston University's energy team, unfortunately passed away before the project was ever completed, but they decided to buy the output of a South Dakota wind farm. And obviously being in the New England area, they were in Nepool, Boston University wasn't really going to ever get theoretical deliverability of those electrons. However, the university believed that it was really important to move, to invest in areas of the grid that were dirtiest and not necessarily where they were going to be taking delivery. So there is a new organization called Emissions First, and in that is Amazon, Meta, Salesforce, GM. They're really focused on that, and there is a UN organization where a signatory, we're one of the co-founding signatories to that, the 24/7 CFE group. One thing that I like to be very clear about, and we'll talk more about these things, is I think it's kind of silly to pick winners and losers. And in fact, what we've seen is, unfortunately, what you see in a lot of these issues within energy is that there's this fight now over 24/7 CFE versus emissionality and who's better and which is more correct. And in the end, it's really the narcissism of small differences, where our goal is to decarbonize the grid, but we can't agree on how to do it. And so these groups end up fighting more with each other than really being focused on the end goal, which is reducing our emissions. And what is the reason behind all that? And really, it's about impact. And I think that's when I talk to people about this, and they're like, "Why would you do this?" First of all, traditional annualized RECs are totally fine. There's nothing wrong with them. But there is a movement towards focusing on impact and focusing on grid decarbonization. And one thing that's important to remember is that hourly data is critical to understanding emissions reductions as well. So no matter what, whether you're in the emissionality camp or the 24/7 CFE camp, in the end, you're going to rely on each other for this data. And so getting this hourly data is really important. And we do hope, and this may be a more controversial issue, which I'd love to hear some of your in the small group sessions, is additionality. I personally hate additionality. I think it's a term that was improperly borrowed from carbon markets and applied to renewable energy markets. And I think there's really no need for additionality if you are focused on emissions impact or the emissionality approach or 24/7 CFE. There's a lot of people that disagree with me about that. There's some very passionate disagreements, but I'm curious to hear what you all think. But I personally think that when you're looking at, so a good example is this discussion over 45B, which is the green hydrogen rules. And we've been having discussions at the federal government level and state levels. But if all you require is additionality, if you build a solar facility and annualize that to meet the needs of a hydrogen electrolyzer, a solar facility is only going to be producing at certain hours of the day. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to reduce emissions. So just additionality alone, meaning it's a new facility to meet that demand, I think can be improperly applied to make people feel better about the emissions reductions. But again, we don't say that that's bad. It's one thing that we try to do is accommodate all of these goals as a service provider in this market. But we do know that no matter what, voluntary customers want better solutions, and that REC systems need to evolve. If you've logged into some of your systems before, you've probably seen they look like basically Excel spreadsheets on the web, and they should not just look better, but function better. And then a big piece of this is access to data and data standards. and working on that. And so there's a ton of, a lot of people say it's just a fad. I would say no. PJM GATS, the registry in the New England area, which just covers some of what we typically consider the Midwest, just announced they're going to be doing hourly tracking. And then we have Executive Order 1457, which is the Catalyzing Clean Energy Industries, which requires the federal government to work towards a 100% 24/7 standard and at least 50% by 2030. And so where's the market? It's been slow to adopt, and that's been frustrating. But I think, sorry, probably why you're glad I'm not there today. And I'm sure my kids are not happy that we're all stuck in the same house. But where is Emirates in the market? We're in the process of implementing the fractionalization, so the ability to issue, transact, meaning buy and sell, and then claim RECs down to the watt level by hour. You don't have to go that granular, but if from a technical standpoint, if you're offering megawatt hours, kilowatt hours, you might as well offer watt hours, and people can decide how low they want to go. Some of the bigger impediments to this is the data validation side. And one of the reasons I'm really bummed that I'm not there to talk with you all is we're really looking to work with universities and other organizations with similar nonprofit values, because validating monthly generation information is a very different animal than validating at an hourly level. And when 1 hour can become worth significantly more than another, it's really important to be able to understand that. And then it's creating data standards. There is a terrible lack of data standards across the US in the energy market. It's that we are actually a great example of data nerds because of cloud infrastructure, so just cloud providers, being able to move data between cloud systems or video game operators. There's standards that have evolved. And so I think that's really important as an example of where we can look at that. And then another thing is kind of amplifying these insights. We're seeing a lot of research come out now. Jesse Jenkins at Princeton has been really great on this in the green hydrogen front. I'm happy to share some of that research. I've presented with him, and I think he's a really a leading mind on this. There's another company that came out of Harvard called Singularity Energy that is really doing a lot of work on this data standards, access to data with RTOs, and providing data to understand. I think, lastly, I wanted to kind of emphasize that we like to think of hourly RECs as the difference between an HDTV and a standard def TV. This actually came from, at the time, a UC Davis researcher, Greg Miller. He's now with Singularity Energy, which I'm really excited about, having someone that understands these markets and has done a lot of research on this in the area. But really, hourly RECs are this next logical step in a move from volumetric 100% annualized goals to more granular goals in decarbonization. And we think about it in terms of resolution and not accuracy. So very similar, you see this definition, this picture of a tiger. And on both of the HD side and the standard def side, it's still a tiger. But the HDTV in the HD side isn't more accurate than what you see in the standard def TV. But the HD image provides more resolution, detail, and nuance to the consumer. And that's what we're trying to do. And we've continued to see this emphasis, including goal or information on, information on the grid mix at the time. And so what can all this be used for? And I'm running up to my time, but there's a lot of interesting use cases that we're seeing. It sends more efficient market signals, which is really critical. I think one exciting place is by understanding where energy is produced and consumed on the grid at a granular level, we can look at where new assets can be placed on the grid to have the greatest decarbonization benefit. Battery storage is a huge thing. One of the things that has always been a frustration, I come also from a policy background, is you see people say more storage is going to inherently be a good thing for the grid. But there's also research to show in certain areas, not all areas, that more storage could actually increase emissions. And so you want to make sure that if you're going to be putting storage assets on the grid, it's actually going to have that. to being able to assure that when you're charging a battery, grid decarbonization levels are low, and when you're discharging, they're high to bring carbon emission level down. And then I think the green hydrogen piece. We're going to have to wrestle with that in 45V. I'm happy to talk about that, but $3 a kilogram is a very rich incentive for the federal government to give, and whether we should require some higher hoops to jump through to achieve that is a really critical decision that could impact emissions for a long time. And so with that, I will hand it over, or I think we're going to do some questions, and then Jordan's going to present, and then small groups.
Thank you, Ben,
Are there any questions?
For your presentation. We have a couple questions in the Q&A, but which I'll read out. But if anyone has any questions who's in the room, also just let us know. So I'll start out with this question that just came in online. Sorry. Could you explain the concept of additionality further? I appreciate your comment about how solar energy only produces energy at certain times of the day, and I'm curious how additionality plays a role in why a new solar panel facility does not necessarily cause a huge change in emissions. That was just submitted a couple minutes ago.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is why these conversations are really nuanced, and I probably spoke a little bit more, and maybe it's the lack of sleep, but so a good example, I think the best example of this additionality question is parts of California, especially Southern California. If you add new renewables to the grid, or specifically solar, you're really just displacing existing solar because of the duck curve, and that there's already such a large, there's already so much solar at certain times that we don't have enough storage to capture it all, unfortunately. And so just adding new resources and making that the only metric by which we measure decarbonization doesn't really capture the full picture. And I know most people aren't saying that, but there's a lot. Another example is North Dakota. You build a new wind facility in an area that is already congested with wind energy in North Dakota. You may just displace less economic wind. Whereas if you build a smaller facility closer to a load center, you may actually have a greater benefit to decarbonizing the grid because you're going to decrease the megawatt hours coming from a nearby coal or natural gas plant. So I think additionality by itself can be a crutch to measure impact, when I think we need to be careful about it being the sole metric. In a lot of cases, there's an obsession with it. So I can give you an example in these discussions that we're having with a lot of folks from the federal government down to like state level is green hydrogen. A lot of people are saying, well, we only want additional new resources. Well, if you're going to shut down a nuclear plant because it's not economic anymore because of the way the markets work, and you're going to build a solar facility to run it, you may actually increase emissions because it may be a fossil resource that is going to fire up to address those hours where the nuclear facility would have. And again, there's a lot of discussions in there because there's cost and other implications, and nuclear isn't a risk-free resource. I get that. So I think these are really nuanced discussions, and we often take blunt force instruments.
Great, thank you. We also have another question that came in while you were just speaking. It says, Ben, can you speak to the work underway in this space in the Midwest and the biggest opportunities you see?
Yeah, so one of the opportunities I think is the most exciting about the Midwest is we have this really great match between our wind facility. Well, a lot of people, I have solar in my house, and it's been really fun to look at the data. And we're using the data actually in some of our experiments within our own organization. But there's a great match between solar production and wind production in the Midwest. wind tends to be less active during the day, especially in the northern Midwest or the upper Midwest, really is what I should say. I'm originally from Detroit. I went to the University of Michigan, and I now live in Minnesota. So I'm more familiar with the upper Midwest, and the wind trends actually match really nicely. So being able to build those facilities to overlap are great. I think we've also seen a really proactive Des Moines, Iowa was the first municipal entity in the world that declared a 24/7 rule. So I know we'll hear more about that later. I think that's really exciting. We tend to be first movers. So I think that is also a really great opportunity. And then understanding how we can be a wind and solar exporter, more likely wind, to other regions of the country through transmission, to provide those resources to them, to other parts of the country when they would otherwise be relying on fossil resources.
Thank you. Also, we have a question asking, do hourly RECs require improved energy infrastructure to actually capture the data?
No. And so we've been capturing hourly generation information since 2019. So the first hourly certificates we issued, we did it very quietly because we wanted to experiment with how much data it would take. But the nice thing about running a software company is that the cheapest part about software is data. If you think about what a thumb drive used to cost in 2005 versus now, I mean, data storage is almost, it's insane how cheap the system is. The problem is actually access to software developers and human talent. But we've been bidding into energy markets on an hourly or sub-hourly level for quite a long time now. So that's what I think is the biggest frustration is you hear people say this is too difficult, but a lot of large entities, especially in C&I customers, they already are really familiar with understanding the hourly pricing if they're and they understand what the sophistication behind this. And the RTOs do too. I think the biggest impediment is that our RTO infrastructure is really outdated. And I've been trying to do a lot of matching between, I'm not somebody that think Europe does everything better. I just want to be very clear because sometimes I feel like people think that. But the European TSOs, which are their version of our RTOs, are much better at understanding technology infrastructure. So the Danish TSO EnergyNet is a great example. They have what they call the Energy Data Hub. Every piece of data is stored in one area of the company. A lot of our RTOs still silo everything, and which is an old idea behind data security, is that the more different silos you have, it's harder to access. Well, no, I mean, that's why cloud infrastructure is so much more secure, because if you have only one point of entry, you can focus your security on that. And nothing's 100% secure. So trying to get the European TSOs to explain that. Now, with that, I often spend time in Europe at conferences learning. The Europeans come up with these ideas, but we can implement them faster because they have a lot more regulation at the EU level. So, for example, the EU Commission by law says that a GO, which is their version of a REC, equals 1 megawatt hour. We never had that definition in the US, so we could break these things into smaller pieces without having to change law.
Thank you. Due to time considerations, I think we're going to move on now to Jordan's presentation.
Testing. Is that working? Good. Okay, let's see if we have a presentation here. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to Zach for helping moderate today, and thank you to Ben for being here virtually and giving you some more background on an issue that is fairly technical and certainly cutting edge. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about some of those municipalities that Ben mentioned that have made 24/7 carbon-free commitments. And we're going to see the notes view here. Thank you. Great. Well, first, I'm Jordan Oster. I'm the Energy Outreach Manager with the Iowa Environmental Council. We're a 501c3 nonprofit located in Des Moines, Iowa. We have 10 staff members. We were founded in 1995, so about 27 years ago. We have a focus on two different program areas, our energy program, which I work in, and our water and land use program. We're also a bit of a coalition model. We have a membership structure where we have 100 plus members across the state. Some of those are county conservation districts. Some of those are solar installers. Some are companies with energy or environmental commitments. Some are retailers. Just a broad group of voices that we rely on to help advance issues in the state. And we also have program staff and our board help direct our own policy initiatives. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our clean energy history in the state. As you may know, we've been a longtime leader in the renewable energy space. In 1983, Iowa became the first state to adopt a renewable portfolio standard. That was 40 years ago now, and I hate to say that it has not been updated since then. It was a requirement for the two investor-owned utilities to have 3 megawatts of renewable energy in their portfolio. 3 megawatts of energy capacity now might be a wind turbine and a half, or 2 wind turbines to get to that amount. So that was the first foray into clean energy policy for the state, but there's been some absence since then. Our first utility scale wind project came in 1998, so you start seeing those wind turbines dotting some of the rural parts of the state. And fast forward another 20 years, and wind energy has now passed coal for the first time for electricity production in the state. We're also at the advent of solar energy in the state. We had our first 100 plus megawatt solar project that went online in 2021 in Louisa County in southeast Iowa. In 2019, I was able to be there and give feedback on a county siting ordinance for solar, and then I was able to go back 2 years later to see the ribbon cutting of that project. Here's a look at Iowa's generation sources for electricity over roughly the last 2 decades. Our blue line here, you can see, is the coal production, and you can see a drop off here in recent years. Gray is wind, which is on the rise there, and there is an amount of fossil gas or natural gas that also does provide some electricity. You can see a little bit of a tapering off on that rise here in recent years as you see more fluctuation in those prices. Iowa's made a lot of progress in reducing emissions from fossil fuel plants in the last 2 decades. We've also see Iowa grow as an exporter of energy, actually a top 10 exporter of electricity. Well, let's focus a little bit on the 2 major clean energy sources. Wind, Iowa is the top state per capita in wind energy production. Texas has the most installed capacity, but it's a smaller percentage of its overall electricity makeup. In 2021, that number was 58% of Iowa's electricity coming from wind energy sources. And I just heard this stat recently, 10% of the nation's wind energy production overall comes from the state of Iowa. Solar, as I said, that's certainly something that's newer. Right now, we're only 43 nationally in terms of installed solar, but the technical potential for solar ranks 16th amongst the states. You can think Iowa is, think about the topography, a lot of flat spots, a lot of sun. It's good for growing crops. It's also good for solar intake. So there's still a lot of room to grow. You can see that there's an expected surge in solar in the MISO interconnection queue. You can look and see all of the different projects that are eyeing interconnection in Iowa. Well, let's talk a little bit about coal. That's something that certainly has reached a peak and has fallen quite a bit in recent years, but there's still an issue with coal plants in the state. Our organization focuses a lot on Mid-American Energy. This is a Berkshire Hathaway company. You may know Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's investment firm. They are one of the top utilities in terms of installed wind energy, but they also operate or own 6 different coal plants in the state of Iowa with no retirement plans until 2049. All at the same time, they claim a 100% renewable vision. And that's really built on producing enough wind energy to meet customer demand in Iowa, but also still running coal and exporting energy into other states, into the market to sell. This photo here on the top is an update I just made yesterday evening. This was on my drive down from Des Moines yesterday. This is the Ottumwa power generating station. It's about 4 hours from here, one of the Mid-Americans. And here is a photo from the Sierra Club. I believe this is Council Bluffs, Iowa, where there are 2 coal plants. Well, give you a little bit of a picture of the energy landscape. Now maybe a little bit about the policy landscape. It is a difficult place to work on some of these issues, even with the advances of clean energy adoption. Still at the state level, it's a difficult path with the governor, the legislature, regulators. And really for us, we've been looking for avenues to expand clean energy policy, and one of those places where we focused is on communities, municipalities. We know that communities are at the front line of climate change, and they can make policies to address it. When we started looking at clean energy goals in the state, there are about 180 cities nationwide that had committed to 100% clean energy. This is kind of a goal like Mid-American is talking about, matching annually 100% of customer needs. But coal is still part of that mix in that scenario. So we're going to talk a little bit today about the 3 cities in Iowa that have aimed for a little bit different goal. I won't dwell too long on this. I think Ben gave a good description of 24/7 carbon-free, but really it's making sure hour to hour the energy that you're using is coming from that clean energy source and it's verifiable. These goals are aiming to be carbon-free, not carbon neutral. A little bit more on that background for you there. We'll look at the second paragraph here quickly too. It's really going to take a lot to get to that 24/7 model. We need to increase our renewables significantly. We need to be able to store and dispatch energy. We need to use our energy more efficiently. And we also need to upgrade our transmission. It can take 10 years from proposal to operation for a transmission project in the country, and we need to speed that up so we can move energy where it's needed and build a modern grid. Ben addressed some of this history of tech companies leading on clean energy goals. Google, yes, is one of those pioneers, and they built a data center in Western Iowa in Council Bluffs about 10 years ago, which is right now considered to be the world's largest data center. They employ about 900 people at this facility, and they do have a planned expansion for it. Microsoft, they have a goal that is like 24/7 carbon-free. They call it 100, 100, 0. I think it's 100% clean energy, 100% of the time, 0 something. They came up with their own. Meta, as Ben mentioned, they are looking at emissionality. They're setting a carbon neutral by 2030 goal across their value chain. All of these companies do have large facilities that keep growing. The Facebook, Meta data center just keeps adding buildings. It's huge, just outside of Des Moines. They say they're going to be the world's largest data center by 2025. So, these ideas kind of inspired us. These companies have located in Iowa because they use a lot of energy, the data centers, but also the energy is affordable. So let's look at the city of Des Moines. This Des Moines, capital city, 200,000 plus people, about 700,000 in the metro area around Des Moines. The first inklings of clean energy and climate organizing a movement came from the Des Moines Citizen Task Force on Sustainability. That was an ad hoc committee created by Mayor Frank County with citizen representatives. They worked on things like an emission study for the city of Des Moines emissions inventory. You may remember back in 2017, President Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Mayor County committed to stay in that and set accordingly greenhouse gas reduction goals for the city. Fast forward a little bit to 2019, the city adopted an energy and water benchmarking ordinance. This requires buildings over 25,000 square feet to report on their buildings' energy use and water use using EPA's portfolio manager tool. Measuring in order to manage energy consumption. And then the city hired a sustainability manager in 2020 as well. This was very helpful for seeing the carbon-free resolution across the finish line. So talking a little bit about the campaign that came together for advocating for a resolution in Des Moines. Conversations started on this early in 2020 when Councilman Josh Mandelbaum started talking with environmental supporters in the city and with that sustainability task force about forming a clean energy goal for Des Moines. Iowa Environmental Council and other partners, we came together in the spring and summer to start organizing a coalition around a carbon-free energy goal, and really had a 5-month public campaign where we were reaching our supporters in the Des Moines Metro, engaging them, asking them to be involved in supporting this goal. We hosted webinars. This was kind of the height of the pandemic, a lot of virtual organizing, informing folks about what this goal could do. We had an active social media campaign. We had some advertising budget. We had some videos from our staff and supporters talking about the importance of this goal that we shared widely. And we also were able to get some earned media interviews and place some op-eds as well in support of this goal. Late in the fall, we announced a 40-member coalition of organizations called the 100% DSM Coalition. DSM is our airport call sign. We, again, got some more attention from that announcement. You can see here, this is the groups that signed on to be publicly supportive. of the initiative, NAACP of Iowa, Nebraska, Beyond Coal and Sierra Club, Raygun. We have some Midwesterners here who might know Raygun, T-shirt company, neighborhood associations, restaurants, just showing a wide swath of support. These companies, some of them have clean energy goals of their own, but they're unable to meet those unless their utility provider is able to do more for them. We were able to deliver a sign-on letter to our city council members. We had 600 residents sign on to a petition, which we sorted by the different wards, so city council people could see who was supporting the initiative in each ward. And ultimately, we had 800 emails sent to the city council as well. This was adopted, the resolution, on January 11th in 2021. Go to the next one. Great. Well, I already got to the end, but let's go back a little bit and talk about what's in that resolution and some of the reasons for it. So, of course, air quality, enhanced public health, business attraction, and local job growth. One of the message lines that we used was Des Moines can be the most sustainable place to do business in Iowa. I want to talk about the local impacts of climate change. This is something that really inspired this resolution as well. Just some repeated severe weather events in the city of Des Moines in recent years. I don't know if anybody's heard of a derecho before. Show of hands. Okay, very good. Too bad that we do know what that is. Des Moines was hit fairly hard by the storm in 2020 in the fall, but then we also had a winter derecho. That's pretty weird. A year later. We had some flooding in Des Moines in 2018. It hit my neighborhood fairly hard. There was a local radio personality who was killed in the flash flooding. Pretty big event. The city and residents adopted a 1% sales tax increase following that flood event, and a lot of the funds actually go to updating water infrastructure following that. A few photos from our IEC staff, some trees down in Des Moines. This is Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and Cedar Rapids lost 65% of its tree canopy from the August 2020 storm. So some pretty serious events that local policymakers are looking at and trying to find some solutions to, because they become more costly for residents, time with power outages, really a scary situation. Grid resiliency and energy security, I mentioned that. Power lines down, we have a lot of trees in Des Moines. Most of our power lines are above ground, not underground like you see in the suburbs. Building and transportation emissions have been a goal of the city. They passed that benchmarking ordinance. And one final piece, they did also update the city's goals to align them with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recommendations. I'll let you take a peek at that while I take a drink. This is a quote from Mayor Frank County following the adoption. I think this is a theme you're going to see as we talk a little bit further. We hope this resolution conveys to other cities that bold actions are necessary. And being the first is not always the easiest thing for a city, but I think a lot of the policymakers in Des Moines recognize what this could do in growing a bigger movement. So how do you achieve the goal? That's the real question to figure out. The city manager has started a process with stakeholders, including utilities, community groups, businesses, to work through this. The city is also now engaged in a climate planning process called Adapt DSM, which will incorporate some of the 24/7 goals into it. The city also has other local actions that they're already in flight or want to increase and do more of. Power purchase agreements to have more solar or energy resources at city buildings, public infrastructure for vehicle charging, etc. So let's look at some of those things that are happening now. I just mentioned the climate planning process. That is happening now. It's going to have a first draft later this spring for community review. The city just announced plans for a large ground mount solar system that's going to power a number of different buildings, city-owned buildings. The fire station is in line for new solar panels. Our parking ramps and structures are seeing more EV charging. The city council has been talking about an ordinance that would help give funds or a tax abatement to developers that develop all electric buildings that don't use gas hookups. And one other thing that came out of the discussions with Mid-American, the utility, was a non-binding agreement where Mid-American was going to do some more to help the city around energy efficiency and public charging. So we'll take a peek at this headline. Who's familiar with franchise agreements? Anybody? So this is a utility pays a city for the rights to run its infrastructure through the city, basically. And the city of Des Moines, Councilman Josh Mandelbaum, was looking to use that franchise agreement renegotiation with Mid-American after the passage of this resolution to try to put in place more requirements on the utility to see the 24/7 goals through. Unfortunately, that did not work. The franchise agreement was approved without changes in terms of setting benchmarks and goals. I think the sub-headline says it well. It depends on the utility in a lot of ways for us to move the needle. But once again, thinking about this strategically, how do we get more cities on board? How do we tip the utility's hand? How do we say, as a large base of customers, that we want a different path? And here's a quote from Josh Mandelbaum, who wrote the original resolution. He's looking to see how we can spread this further. Well, now let's look at the city of Waterloo. Waterloo is not a battle site in Belgium, the last great stand of Napoleon. No, it's an eastern Iowa city, population about 80,000 people. And they committed to 24/7 carbon-free last summer. It's one of Iowa's most diverse communities. They have a majority black city council, a black mayor. The majority of the council is also under 35 years old. So a really interesting place where they're working on some progressive policy. The city council declared a climate emergency declaration in 2020, and they passed a resolution that really built on that, as well as matching some of the same aspirations of the Des Moines resolution. Again, Mid-American, they made a non-binding agreement to help the city with some different projects. It's not binding, but it's nice that through this process of coming up with a resolution that the cities are able to get a little more assistance on some of the local actions that they have planned. And finally, Waterloo is working with university partners. University of Northern Iowa is in a neighboring community right next door, who's helping not only with implementation of 24/7, but also an emissions inventory. See here a quick quote from Jonathan Grider, who wrote the climate emergency declaration and supported the resolution. He's recently been appointed to the EPA's Local Government Advisory Committee, so it's great to be gathering that perspective and bringing it back to his community. Okay, the cities just keep getting smaller. Windsor Heights, Iowa, this last fall adopted a 24/7 resolution. Now this is a little bit different. By 2030, Des Moines and Waterloo are both looking at a 2035 adoption. As I said, small, it's about 5,000 plus people, smallest city in the nation to make this type of pledge. They had nothing on the books previously about climate or energy, and this is kind of their first big discussion. And I think it's going to lead them in good places as well. This resolution is really kickstarting some future work by the city. The Des Moines and Waterloo resolutions I didn't mention, they both faced some watering down from the original proposals. Both of the Des Moines author, Waterloo author wanted 2030 as a timeline for accomplishing the goal. They wanted to mention the franchise agreement being a place where changes could be made. They mentioned Mid-American's coal plants in the resolutions. The first drafts, Mid-American came in with a red pen in each of those cities and got rid of those lines. Ultimately, these city councils all adopted these resolutions unanimously, but not in the first versions of Des Moines and Waterloo. Windsor Heights slipped under the radar, and Mid-American didn't show up, didn't have suggested changes, and they were able to pass something that was more ambitious, mentions the coal plants, and wants to do it by 2030. Share a little quote by the mayor of Windsor Heights here. They say they know what their energy needs are. It's a small, landlocked suburb, mostly residential, not a lot of commercial. There's some infill that could be potentially down the line, but not much. So they kind of know what their energy needs are going forward, and that's part of the reason why he liked the 2030 timeline. Some of these things were already covered by Ben. Some other cities that passed resolutions in between Des Moines and Waterloo. South Lake Tahoe, they have a 2030 goal as well. I remember reading news coverage. They were very excited to say we're going to get this done first. There's executive orders from the Biden administration just soon after the Des Moines resolution passed, where they called for a 24/7 carbon-free energy grid by the year 2035, but also by the year 2030, the federal government is going to procure 50% of its energy from carbon-free sources. We've been able to participate in some great efforts amongst international and national nonprofits. World Resources Institute has brought together a lot of US cities to talk about 24/7, to meet on a monthly basis and get closer to commitment in some cases, but also some of the cities who are already committed are participating in that group as well. C40 Cities is another great resource. And the UN, 2 years ago, they formed the UN 24/7 Carbon-Free Energy Compact. It brings together a lot of different companies who are trying to figure out the technology and verification side, but also municipalities and environmental groups. Tracking, very important. There are some software development that is making that easier to do, but still data sharing from the utilities is a tough thing too. We know cities in Iowa have requested some of this use data from Mid-American. Have not been successful with those requests. And finally, lest you think Des Moines is going to be the most prominent city to adopt 24/7, there's now pilot programs in Paris, Copenhagen, and London that are, I believe, either C40 cities or the UN Carbon-Free Compact are helping assist with those. Okay, well, there is the presentation so far. We'll take a little time for questions. We'll get a microphone for you. Thank you. Up back there.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I'm curious what the plan is for addressing use of natural gas for heating and cooking.
Yeah, it's difficult in Iowa. Some of you may be aware of a wave of legislation that swept the country last year. A ban on natural gas bans. We saw that in several different states across the country, really trying to limit what municipalities can do in terms of saying no new hookups. The incentive approach is probably going to be the way that it gets done in Iowa. Either incentives from governments in the form of a tax abatement or incentives from federal resources that are coming. But there are limitations on what can be done at the local level in Iowa around gas. And it might be the same in your state too if you haven't heard of that.
There are various articles in the literature describing 100% renewable energy systems and almost 100%. And the difference between going to 99% and 100% is huge. And so it seems to me that aiming for 95 or 99% is a realistic, visible goal. We can see how much it'll cost. 100% seems more aspirational. And so in this political climate, does it make more sense to pursue a realistic goal or an aspirational goal?
That's a really good question. And I think we hear that last 10% of decarbonization is going to be the hardest. There's just different industries that use different things, and that transition is going to be a lot more difficult. In terms of organizing and getting people around something big and aspirational, I think let's project into that 2050 zone, 27 years from now. Hopefully we are to that 100% point. But I don't really quibble, thinking we can get there 99%. But ultimately, I think to move folks, it's talking about the biggest thing.
Hey, Jordan, do you mind if I pipe in?
Yes,
I know
please.
it's your Q&A. I feel bad.
No,
I wonder
please.
if I'm like the voice of. I wonder if I'm like the voice of God now, like coming in with the. You can't see me, but I think what your answer was perfect, Jordan. And I think it's important to add that don't get caught up in what other people are doing. It's really important to focus on what works for your specific needs as a municipality, a university, or corporate. I think it's really easy to just jump right into, well, we gotta, this was actually pretty common for a while as people were one-upping each other. Like Google did 24/7 by 2030. Microsoft was 100% renewable, or 100% clean, 100% of the time, zero carbon. And then you had the emissionality people, which is to reduce their emissions. In the end, it really should be about what works for you, and anything is progress. And I think one of the things Jordan mentioned is, although when you do set those lofty goals, we tend to see people achieve them, including in Minnesota and in surrounding states where we set these goals that we thought were going to be impossible to meet, a 30% renewable or 20% renewable in 10 years, and we achieve those goals in 5 to 7 years. So I think it's important to remember that what is possible, what seems impossible now will be actually probably much easier in 5 to 10 years.
Thank you, Ben. Question back there.
Thank you for your talk. Historically, Iowa and energy equals bioethanol. Iowa farmers have received a lot of federal funds for this. I'm wondering, as the transition goes to EVs and electricity, this is obviously bad for the ag business. How do these communities view these transitions? Are they on board? Are they putting up resistance?
Yeah, that's a interesting question. And yeah, I think you definitely hear more about Iowa's biofuel numbers than you do from wind energy. And I think that's also a symptom of some of our policymakers in Congress or the governor who when they talk about Clean Energy Week or Clean Power Week, they say, oh, and biofuel leadership. That's not electricity. I think that the most important thing is going to be for that adoption is going to be seeing these vehicles in their communities. When a Ford F-150 Lightning rolls into Ottumwa for a charge, I think that's going to attract some attention. And there's a big fight right now, rhetorically and otherwise, around biofuels. But I think the future of transportation needs to be electric. I think there's always going to be a place to sell corn.
I also wanted to say there are a few questions online, but I don't think we have time for all of those. So what do you think we should do, Jordan?
We'll do one more and then we'll have maybe a little discussion time.
Okay.
Or should we let people decide whether they want to do discussion versus small groups?
Yeah, that was probably a good idea. Ben, we have Zach here with the microphone. Maybe he can bring it around to folks and we can have the discussion here together. And Ben, you might pose a few other questions for us as well. I think you might mention something else you want to chat with folks about. But here's just a number of questions to get you thinking. Why don't you just give yourself a minute to take a look at these, and then we can kind of talk with each other, see what kind of questions you have, reflections you have based on these. Let's jump in for number one. We can take a little bit of time to look at the questions as we're going. Anybody want to share about a clean energy goal that's either in their community level or at their institution? Do you think it's going far enough? And anybody want to explain that? Anybody with a progressive city goal or university goal? Back there.
One thing that was interesting in Kansas City that happened was that our investor-owned utility, Evergy, created a program, a subscription program for wind energy for local communities. And communities could adopt over different time frames and different amounts of their municipal operations to be powered by renewable energy. And I want to say there's about 15 or so that have done it. Kansas City, Missouri at this point might be, for example, 90% carbon-free for their municipal operations. Others might reach 100, some might be at 50%, but it was an offering that Evergy put together. They pulled the subscriptions together that enabled them to invest in another wind farm in western Kansas, and it just helped everybody it was sort of an easy button. There wasn't a big cost increment for folks, and so it was one step along the way.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We often hear about community solar subscription. Interesting to hear from buying some of the production from a wind turbine. And yeah, there are several Midwestern examples that we looked at when we were coming up with a Des Moines goal and advocating for it. And Kansas City was one of those places where we certainly had some good instruction. Anybody else want to share about their community or institution, what you might be doing for pledges?
So I represent a local municipality here in St. Louis, and we've got a sustainability commission that I'm part of. I guess we definitely have these aspirations, but we haven't set clear goals yet. And I think one of the questions we have, and really kind of relates to a lot of these questions, is so setting this goal, is great, but how does the entity like the municipality actually affect that change? Aside from those, purchasing these wind or, community solar type, saying, like paying extra, I guess, for those types of energy. Is there anything else you can do, because they purchase that energy from, the provider, aside from, installing enough owned solar or whatever to cover their needs? How do you kind of affect that change?
Yeah, and that's a difficult question. I think it's kind of the crux of a lot of these resolutions too. We're really dependent on the power that's sent to us. I didn't use the M word, municipalization. There's some cities that are look to get more freedom by doing it themselves. We had a small city in Iowa, Decorah, that tried to do that. A different utility provider up there, and they spent pretty heavily to defeat that initiative and narrow loss. Yeah, I mean, what can be done for power purchase agreements? The city can figure out its own operations and make those 100%, but that doesn't really necessarily translate to the community. And I think there's some other gaps. Des Moines in particular is trying to fill their specific programs around efficiency, trying to up those charging opportunities. But still, it's about saying as energy customers to our utilities, we want something different. Des Moines, Waterloo, Windsor Heights, added up their retail electric sales estimates for those three cities is 21% of Mid-Americans' electricity sales in Iowa. Can we keep growing that number? What's a tipping point where enough cities, enough entities say they want a different path? That's one of those questions. But you're right. There's a lot of things that can be done, but it doesn't necessarily change the mix of what community members are getting. It might change what the city facilities are, but that's the more difficult part. Unless you have a municipal utility that's able to go further.
I guess.
I think.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I'll let you go and I can follow up after.
Oh, I was just going to say, since we only have 10 minutes, if we wanted to move on to the next question, but if you had something else you wanted to add.
Yeah, so one of the things I was going to point out is that this is an interesting issue because we found examples where municipalities are actually already far on their way towards this, and sometimes they didn't even know it. A great example, and I can provide more information, but Dane County, which is where University of Wisconsin-Madison is located, MG&E, which is Madison Gas and Electric, which is the service provider in that territory, already has the RER tariff, which is public, where they actually already match on an hourly basis solar production from a facility that is on county land but owned by the utility to specific 7 county meters. And they are given a credit when there's more production than usage, and they pay a specific tariff when it's lower to procure renewable energy in its place. And so I use this example to show that this shouldn't be that hard. It's utilities and sophisticated customers are already procuring electricity on hourly or sub-hourly basis. So it serves as an example that the technology and sophistication at, and MG&E is not one of the bigger utilities in the Midwest. I would say it's one of the smaller ones. So the sophistication to do this exists. A lot of times it takes the prodding, and personally, I think municipalization is often used more as a threat to get what they want than actually wanting to create the municipal actually wanting to create their own utility at this time because of the massive investment it takes to get there. But going to the legislature, speaking, and more often is working directly with the utility. I mean, a lot of these utilities are starting to understand that we live in a different age where you can order anything you want to your house and it can be there within a day. And so that they can't just push off their customers to say, sorry, that's too hard. They need to be more responsive, and we're seeing that. So I think going right to the, I'm not saying that Jordan or anyone was saying going right to the municipalization route, but I think there's a lot that can be done just with working directly with the utility to get these tariffs out and explore unique opportunities.
Thanks, Ben. It looks like we've already spent some conversation on number 4, a few ideas. We'll look at question number 3. And then if we don't have too much conversation on that, maybe we'll see if we have any last minute questions for Ben and I to wrap up. But anybody want to share on number 3 about stakeholders? Yeah, get the microphone for you.
Good morning, I'm Jim Poyser with Earth Charter Indiana. In terms of stakeholders and supporters, in a very tough state, we've had some success in municipalities by engaging young people. And by that, I mean 10 years old on up. And Rachel in South Bend, my hometown, can speak to that. We've had 10 cities pass climate resolutions led by kids. And I really have enjoyed this session because it challenges me to get to a level of sophistication with these young people, which is very possible, to advocate for carbon-free energy goals. But if anybody's struggling with this in their municipality, Our Children's Trust, I Trust, iYouth Matter, and Earth Charter Indiana, we have some great tools to get young people engaged because it's their future and adults can't say no to kids.
Thank you very much. Yep, that's a very important stakeholder, and I think we see that energy so much with youth climate organizers, but just youth who live in this climate. And thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? Maybe talking about positive stakeholders. Any impediments stakeholders that you can think of? Is there a certain business or utility or other group that might make it harder for you to adopt a goal? Okay, I'll read the silence. Let's open it up to just general Q&A. We have about 5 minutes left, so any questions for Ben or myself? Yep.
So one thing that was kind of confusing me during your presentation was that you have all these goals for 2030 and 2035 complete carbon-free energy, but I also know that you were talking a lot about the wind energy being very prominent in Iowa, but wind energy isn't able to be produced all the time because sometimes it's just not windy enough. So what is Iowa doing, and I guess in general what are other states doing in order to provide carbon-free energy when you have these environmental factors that keep you from using those renewable sources?
Yeah, that's a good question. I meant to spend a little more time on that in the slide about wind and solar stats, or maybe it was the Mid-American slide. The Mid-American just recently announced a multi-billion-dollar project they're calling Wind Prime that is going to add 2,000 plus megawatts of wind. Every few years, they roll out a big clean energy portfolio. Only 2% of this proposal is solar, and they're asking for $50 million to study battery instead of installing battery. Mid-American has set up a system that keeps us with coal because they keep investing in wind, and coal can run during those peak times to make the system work. We need to change the mix for sure. We need to be able to ramp up that solar so we're producing in the hottest, warmest times of the day. We know wind typically performs best at night, but yeah, we need that solar, wind, storage, dispatchability to make it happen. There's choices that are being made that are locking us into the system. We love wind, we need wind, but we also know that we need solar to produce during those peak times. Back there.
Hello.
Is there any other questions? I had a quick comment. Oh,
You can go ahead if you.
no, I want to hear the question. It's more editorial than anything else.
So you mentioned that the utility, the negotiations weren't, successful, to put words in your mouth. What is the plan in going forward with working with the utility? How do you plan to stick to your plan with such a impediment?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficulty. We have a list of other cities that have upcoming expirations for franchise agreements. There's definitely some growing literature on places that have been successful with that, but that might not ultimately be the course. But I think we're still interested in that as an avenue. IEC, we're an outside advocacy group. We're sometimes friendly when it comes to making sure we get good policies that get wind and solar sited. But we're adversarial when it comes to coal generation. But yeah, I mean, we have some role to play in that, but cities too are their own independent actors in this. And I've been really excited to see kind of a bench of environmental and climate leaders forming in the state. I think there's becoming more of a network to do that. But we're going to do all that we can from the outside to help make that happen. But I think there's still some policy innovation that's going to come from within as well.
And I would say one thing that we're starting to see is, and it kind of goes to what Jordan said, is getting some of these, on both sides of this issue, clearing away some of the, I think, misunderstandings between, I want to say both sides, because I hate to think of it like like there's that we're challenging each other. But for example, like the federal government is the largest energy purchaser in the country. And they, through their procurement process and the Defense Logistics Agency, which I didn't even know existed, is starting to require these 24/7 opportunities in their contracts that will move markets. Something like Iowa, which is unique in having two of currently the largest and possibly the second largest data center in the North America or in the world, with the Google data center there, are starting to respond directly to those customers. And I think there's also a new challenge with some of the stakeholders on the other side. Like I heard the kids being mentioned. It's really a good opportunity to mention, like, if you want to have cell phones and electric vehicles, like, we're going to need to build infrastructure, and it's not always going to be pretty, and it's going to sometimes go through areas, so every time we fight transmission lines, it makes it harder to electrify transportation and to achieve decarbonization. So, I mean, there's a lot of opportunities, I think, to try to solve these issues. And I mean, in some ways, that's what makes it exciting, but also a little bit discomforting and frustrating too. But I have hope that I'm starting to see the tide turn. Southern Company or Duke Energy came out with a 24/7 tariff that they're proposing. A question I've gotten pushback with utilities on is, well, we're not allowed to rate-base cloud infrastructure, so we can't do a lot of these things on our own. Well, I was told by two commissioners, like, that's not true. That's just a misunderstanding or a misreading of what we've allowed. If it benefits the customers, they can rate-base it. And so that, getting that out there should allow them to build more of their own cloud infrastructure to help provide some of these data solutions. So I have hope that I think this oh God, what am I trying to say here? This kind of process where we're almost fighting each other is I think we're getting past that a little.
Thank you, Ben. I know we're just at time too. More talking gets me thinking. I want to go back to your question really quick too. One thing I didn't mention about the tech customers in Iowa, I don't think it's just the municipalities that can apply pressure. The tech customers are part of a secretive, shadowy trade industry group that launched this year that's saying we want the ability, a legislative ability or legislature to approve the ability for entities to buy directly from the MISO market. They're not happy with the coal mix of Mid-American, and they're looking to get out of the system potentially. Maybe that pressure makes Mid-American change, but there's also some worries too. If you have those big customers leave Iowa, are normal ratepayers just stuck with the dirty energy and paying the higher bills. Well, we're past time. Thank you, Ben, so much for being here with us virtually. Thank you for everybody being here today in person.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, please reach out, Ben at emirates.org. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there, both due to snow and thankfully I didn't make the flight because now I would be sitting in my room doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you again to both of our speakers, both here in person and remotely. Sorry to any of the questions that were submitted online that we didn't have time to get to. And again, a recording of this workshop will be made available in the next few days on the Whova app. These recordings will be available in the app for the next 3 months. And our next round of workshops begins at 11 a.m., so within the next half hour. Feel free to help yourselves to coffee and refreshments in the Frick Forum, which is in the first floor of Knight Hall near where you checked in. It's just outside here. Thank you again.
Thank you.